All right. Welcome back to Race, Place, and Inequality. So today we are talking about spaces, American Apartheid, and HarlemWorld. Please be sure to view the video assignments, the videos from your classmates. They are under student lecture videos. Those are also part of the lecture. So I do want you to, view those videos and understand the things that your classmates are talking about in those videos. So there are some things that I will go over again, but then there's other things that I just kind of leave to them. So I don't feel like, always saying like if they're already discussing it, I may talk about it a little bit, give a little bit more detail, but that's it. So with that being said, this is for the week of September 27th and September 29th, Monday and Wednesday. Please make sure that you're keeping up with the readings. Also, just the first slide, be reminded that you have an exam next Wednesday. I will provide more detail in the next lecture video and PowerPoint. So I'll let you know exactly how it's going to be laid out. You can go ahead and start studying your PowerPoint, start studying your notes. If there's something that you haven't read yet, you should probably go ahead and read it. Yeah, make sure you're studying your PowerPoint, studying your notes for the exam. I wouldn't necessarily reread all the material, but if you've been watching these videos and you've been paying attention and you've been taking good notes from the lectures, then you should be good. So with that being said, let's go straight into it. So one thing that Rashad Shabazz talks about in detail here is the notion of the kitchenettes. He talks about kitchenettes. So that's on the next slide. And we talked a little bit about the term black belt, right? What black belt meant. If you recall, black belt was the term that was used to describe the very concentrated areas that Black people lived in Chicago when they first moved from the north, first moved to the north from the south. Because of residential segregation, they weren't allowed to live in certain parts of the city. And so they could only live essentially in what was called the Black Belt. It was only like a few miles long. And so you had thousands upon thousands of people, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of families living in these, in this kind of small radius, this Black Belt. And so that was typically on the south side of Chicago. And so it was on the south side, and even now, the predominantly Black side of Chicago is still called the South Side, even though Black people can now live in other parts of the city. The South Side of Chicago is still where you find a lot of the cultural institutions. It's where you find a lot of people who have come from Chicago, who have, been leaders on a national scale or a global scale. Typically, if they're Black, they're from the South Side of Chicago, not all the time, but a lot of them are from the South Side. So Michelle Obama, the former First Lady of the United States, she was from the South Side of Chicago. So many other well-to-do African-Americans, so many other African-American leaders that were from Chicago are from the South Side. So it has a long, rich history of African-American culture. However, during this time, so again, we're talking about the early 20th century, because of the residential segregation, because of the lack of economic opportunities, that were afforded to Black people to actually buy homes, many of them were forced to stay in, particularly the poor and working class African Americans were forced to stay in these very small apartments. And when I say small, I'm talking like dorms. Like maybe your dorm might be maybe a little bit bigger than what was called the kitchenettes that these people had to live in. So you talk about maybe two dorm rooms, not dormitories, but two dorm rooms. And you may have two families, a family or two families living in something that made up maybe two dorm rooms, right? So it was very, very, very small. It was very, very cramped. And so these very, very cramped spaces made it difficult. Anybody who lives in a cramped space, it will be difficult for you to kind of carry out and be your full self if you're always having to worry about somebody watching you, somebody looking at you, and so it can be tough. So kitchenettes were, according to Rashad Shabazz, was the mechanism that was used to instill carceral power in the Black Belt. So in order to essentially incarcerate people, keep people confined, keep people in a very close proximity, they were forced economically into these kitchenettes, right? Kitchenettes were like, again, something like projects, right? I don't know if you ever heard of projects or public housing, something like that, very, very small apartments. So it was here where Black men became more violent, a lot of times due to these cramped spaces, because we have a natural ability, a natural want to kind of spread out, right? Everybody, I remember a friend of mine who lived in Nigeria, and he moved to the States in the 90s, and he went to high school with all of us and college and everything. And he talked about how one of the biggest things he realized when he moved to the States was that everything was so close, right? Even in the South. And he talked about how in Nigeria or in Africa in general, everything is so spread out. So it's just, you have land and you just have so much land, you have so much space to kind of do what you want, do what you need to do. And so to be able to have space, to be able to have land, even in areas with big houses, I remember him saying that even what would be seen as the upper class, it's not really seen as upper class in certain parts of Africa or in other countries because you don't have a lot of land. You don't have as big of a backyard as maybe if you had like a mansion with like sitting on a couple of acres or something like that. But that would be something normal in certain parts of Africa, right? So being cramped and being confined is a way in which people look to reproduce inequality, because when you reproduce inequality, when you force a lot of people into a small space, one of the things that's going to happen is that those people are going to fight for that space because we have a natural want for space, for opportunity. Space allows for us to think. It allows for us to plan. It allows for us to assess our situations. Imagine if you were in a classroom, or actually, this is the reason why a lot of people look at class success and school success based on how many people are in a classroom per teacher, right? Because if you have 15 students per teacher, well, that's great, especially if the classroom is big, you can spread out, you have space, you have time to think, the teacher has time to move around the classroom, help with each student. If you have 50 to 60 students per teacher, and we're talking about K through 12, not professors, college professors, but K through 12, that's difficult, right? There's a lot of people in the classroom. You have to answer a lot of questions. You have to be in charge of a lot of different people. It's just a lot. And so again, cramped spaces, being confined has an effect on the psyche. It has an effect on how people can develop, but it also forces people to have to argue and fuss and fight, and in some ways be violent over the little bit of space that they have. And many times, because they don't have the opportunity or sometimes the wherewithal to even think that instead of fighting each other, we should be fighting the people that are keeping us in these confined spaces. Many times they're like, well, this is where I was born, this is all I know. And so in order for me to get even more space in this little space that I do have, I'm going to have to fight for it. And so typically what you start to see is you start to see violence happening when people are confined. And it's not just Black people, that's anybody. If you confine any human species, if you confine animals in a small space, they're going to fight each other. If you confine fish in a small bowl, they're going to fight each other. One of them might try to eat the other one or something if you do that. Same thing with human beings. And so what happens is, a lot of African Americans who fled from the South to the North, hoping to find freedom, found that they were just running to different types of problems. And so many of them became angry. Some of them wanted to run away. And these cramped spaces, again, made it hard for people to have control over space. And so you have this in-group violence. Sometimes we call it Black on Black crime, but it should be called in-group violence because then it shows that, number one, in-group violence is not singularly applied to Black people. In fact, if you look at statistics, the criminology statistics on in-group violence, it happens pretty much the same across the board in terms of percentage, right? Meaning that most people commit crimes against people that look like them because we live in a very residentially segregated country. So most people are going to live in places and spaces where people reflect where they are racially and where they are on a class status. And so more than likely when people commit crimes, they're going to commit crimes against people that look or are part of their same social status. So typically you're not going to find a rich, wealthy person committing a crime against a poor person because they're going to be with rich, wealthy people. So they're probably going to commit some kind of white collar crime, right? Embezzle money or something like that. A poor person, generally speaking, you won't find too many poor people going into the houses of very, very, very rich people coming from their side of town, going all the way 45 minutes to another side of town to get past their gate, to get past the security, to go into their house and try to rob them and then take all that stuff and drive all the way back to the poor side of town. Doesn't make sense. Typically, poor people, people of a certain racial group are going to commit those crimes against people right next door, people that look just like them. So it's easier for them to blend in. So again, crimes are typically committed within group anyway, which is why the myth about Black on Black violence or Black on Black crime should be put to rest. And so we're going to see later on that men's identities also can start to affect women's identities when we talk about these cramped spaces. And so because of these kitchenettes, Black people did not have to interact with police to experience carceral power at this time because it was domesticized. Essentially, was what Rashad Shabazz argues, not only here, but across the board in this text. When basically, similar to Foucault, what he's saying is you didn't have to put people in prisons in order to keep them in cramped spaces, keep them incarcerated. You created neighborhoods and houses that were incarcerated, neighborhoods and houses that were confined, that were under constant surveillance, so that they did not have to be arrested in order to experience that. And so later on, what we end up finding is that the police power moved essentially from the neighborhoods and communities to the homes, right? When Black people did have to interact with the police, they did not have to be arrested and brought to a jail in order to have that constant interaction. Their areas were over-policed anyway. So the police came into those areas, stayed in those areas, patrolled those areas, surveyed those areas, and whether they were in plain clothes or whether they were in police uniforms, whether they were hopping out of unmarked cars, whether they were coming in marked cars, there was a constant police presence. There was constant surveillance in these incarcerated neighborhoods. And so the homes and the streets essentially became prisons for Black people in the Black Belt. And so the kitchenettes absorbed the exercise of police power, and these kitchenettes essentially functioned in the general space of the Black Belt and brought carceral power closer to the people, right? It brought carceral power closer to the people when we talk about kitchenettes keeping everybody and everything confined. And so because of that, and I believe we're going to get into it, let me see if we get into the health piece. No, we don't get into the health piece in this one. But but yeah, so essentially you have, you know, these issues of space and the exercise of police power, again, that is not confined to prisons, but brings the prisons to the neighborhoods. So I think we talked about this before. I don't know if I went into detail, but we'll talk about it a little bit again, how these kitchenettes came to be. So initially, these areas started out with having, these were apartments, public housing apartments that were created for white men who had come back from the war, right? So white men, white families who had come back from the war, and also spaces for European immigrants. So people who needed money, people who needed some time to be able to transition into eventually owning a home, because if you first move into a country, you need time to brand, you know, you need time to get a job, you need time to save money, you need time to look for a home and purchase a home in a good neighborhood. If you're coming from war and you dealt with PTSD and, you know, you need time to save money, you need time to find a job. So that's what these apartments were originally. The Black people during that time lived in what was called the slums. And so the slums were like these, I don't even know if they were homes. They were just boxes, essentially, that they lived in, just makeshift rooms in the back of alleys. Sometimes you're talking about mostly the poor and working class, makeshift somethings in the back of alleys behind many of the nicer homes, nicer white homes within the city Black people tended to live in. And most of the time it was because they were working in those homes, maybe cutting grass, taking care of the children. The women were domestic maids. And so it was really kind of almost like slavery in that you had the plantation. And then on the plantation, you had what was called the slave quarters, or the quarters where the enslaved Africans would eat and sleep and live, essentially. And so it was very similar to that when you're talking about where people were living. But for those people who were coming back from war, those European immigrants who needed some help, the government invested in public housing, and public housing was put in place to help them transition. And so these public housing areas were, or this public housing started, I want to say like the 1930s, something like that, in the 1930s in two major cities, Chicago and Atlanta. So these were the first two cities that had public housing. And they did the public housing experiment. And then from there, they started to open public housing in places, usually in big cities in the north, and then they started opening them up in more rural areas. So even in the south, you have, you know, public housing areas. They may not be as tall as they are in like New York or Philly, but definitely they're sometimes just widespread as opposed to tall like they are in the big cities. And so, so they were nice urban apartments, and they were kept up very well by the local, state, and federal governments. There was money that was given, and if you see pictures, you could Google pictures of early public housing, and you'll see white people playing outside, and you'll see them in these apartments, and they're jumping rope or they're running with their kids, and it's nice. The lawns are cut. It almost looks kind of like a college campus a little bit. It kind of looked like that. At a college campus, just really beautiful, really nice. And it was invested in, it was well taken care of. Those people didn't have to pay a lot of money, you know, maybe a couple of dollars a month for rent. So until they got enough money to, till they got enough money to move into a home. And so they were very nice urban apartments. after American whiteness was adopted by European immigrants, these European immigrants started to, like what we talked about with Max Nudebar, they started to gain more access to opportunities, more access to jobs, more access to money. And so now they did not have to live in these urban apartments anymore, because now they had the opportunity to get a home. And once white Americans were no longer scared of European immigrants and were okay with living next to a Scottish person or an Italian person or an Irish person because they saw them all as white, then they had the opportunity to live there. And so now these kitchenettes were open. These public housing units were open. Well, guess who's going to move into them? African Americans. And so Black people started to move into these kitchenettes because they were subsidized by the government anyway. So we need somebody to live in here. So more Black people started to move from those slums and those little alleyways. Poor and working class Black folks began to move into the public housing. But when the kitchenettes became closely associated with Black people, you start to see the housing quality decrease. Now, there are people who will suggest that, well, the housing quality decreased because the Black people didn't take care of it. They didn't take care of the units. And there's no research that can be something that a conclusion a person can come to, but there's no research to back that up. However, there is research to suggest that there was a lack of funding after a certain time for these public housing units, right? You also have more dirty landlords who now have these tenants, and they're not taking care of their needs. They're not fixing the toilets, they're not fixing the sinks, they're not fixing the elevators, they're not fixing anything. And they allow the buildings to just run down, but then they still charge them the same amount for rent, and sometimes even go up on their rent, and then they're still getting money from the government. And so the government is thinking, oh, well, we'll just keep subsidizing, we'll just keep taking tax money and making sure that Americans are being able to live in a good home, when in actuality, these people were getting away with allowing with the units, with the buildings to be worn down. Many of them became cramped and rat infested. As more and more families began to move in, they would not build bigger rooms. They wouldn't build bigger buildings. They were all just cramped into these rooms. Again, filled with roaches, filled with rats. And so as race was redefined, space was redefined, which I think is quite interesting. Race was being redefined, when whiteness was being redefined to include Europeans. Now these public housing spaces was being redefined to now mean something different than what it originally meant. What it originally meant was transition from poor working class to middle class. What it meant for these people, these Black people who were moving in, now this space doesn't mean transition. It means you're stuck, you're gonna stay here, and there's no way for you to get out. So space was redefined as the whiteness and race was being redefined. And so what a lot of African Americans who were leaving the South realized is that they were not living in any better conditions than they were when they were in the South. Okay. They weren't really in any better conditions. A famous writer by the name of Richard Wright said that it was their punishment for moving north and trying to find a better life. How could you leave our Southern white brothers and sisters to fend for themselves in the cotton fields and in the rice fields? Oh, you want to move up here? Okay, we'll show you. You can move up here, but life ain't gonna be that much different. And it wasn't. The conditions weren't that much better. While they didn't have to worry about being lynched, they did have to worry about being beat up by the police and thrown in jail. While they didn't have to worry about maybe sleeping outside or sleeping in a farm, they did have to worry about sleeping in a cramped apartment with roaches and rats. crawling all around them. I have a friend, when I was giving this very similar lecture in another class where I taught about race, place, and it was called Race, Place, and Space. And I had a friend of mine who is a PhD student now. She's getting ready to finish her dissertation. She taught at another university, and she talked about she grew up in Harlem, New York. We're getting ready to talk about Harlem in a second. She grew up in Harlem, New York in the 1980s and 1990s. So some of you may know that was at the height of what is called in US history, particularly in contemporary US history, the crack era. So that is when crack cocaine was very prevalent in a lot of poor Black communities, poor Black and Hispanic communities. Crack cocaine was a drug that was very present during that time. And it also caused that among hyper-policing, not gentrification, hyper-policing, drugs, underdevelopment, and unemployment and underemployment, as well as undereducation, really brought down a lot of Black communities. There was a lot of poverty, a lot of crime, a lot of violence going on during those times. Well, she grew up right in the midst of that. And she talks about, I remember she talked to my students about growing up in a kitchenette. They didn't call it kitchenettes at the time, but that's what it was. She grew up in a kitchenette. And I remember she said that she used to play a game where she would lay in her bed and just kind of let her arm kind of lay off her bed. And as the mice or the rats would run on the floor, she would try to grab it and catch it. And that's a game that her and her like cousins or whoever would play, because that was the conditions in which they were living. And so it wasn't easy. And that was in the 80s and the 90s. And we're talking, Rashad Shabazz is talking about like the 30s and 40s and 50s. So wasn't that much different, even in 50, 60 years. So it's quite interesting, right? So the kitchenettes, going to the next slide, was a result of residential segregation and unjust housing policies. And we're going to talk a little bit, and you're going to actually see some more about the unjust housing policies, as well as if you've read the American Apartheid piece, which we want to talk about in a second. And I think some of your classmates did a lecture video, a video lecture on that. You're going to see some of the things around residential segregation that was very much unjust. And so because of the fact that Black people were only allowed to live in the Black Belt during that time, because there were things such as redlining that did not allow for African Americans to get loans to live in areas that were outside of their Black Belt, because and this, well, actually the redlining part probably came about after the civil rights, because before that there was even no civil rights legislation that allowed for fair housing. So essentially you just couldn't do it. It was just against the law. It was against the law to integrate neighborhoods, no matter how much money you had. So what was interesting about the Black Belt that Rashad Shabazz talks about is that the Black Belt was very much interclass. So while you had these people who were living in these horrible conditions, very poor conditions, it was also the home of Dr. Daniel Hayes. I want to say there's a Black doctor who did like the first blood transfusion. It was the home of Quincy Jones. I don't know if you're familiar with Quincy Jones. Quincy Jones, well, he grew up poor though. So he lived in the Black Belt too, but he was in the poor part. But he is like the most famous music producer of all time. He produced Michael Jackson. His biggest thing was probably Michael Jackson's Thriller. He was the music arranger for, what's his name? I Did It My Way. What's the dude's name? Call him Blue Eyes, Frank Sinatra. I mean, all anybody you could think of, any famous music people from the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s. Quincy Jones probably had his hand in that, and then his sons, I think, did a lot of, when hip hop became a thing, they were in hip hop and all of that. So anyway, crazy amounts of money now that he's made, hundreds of millions of dollars. But he comes from that Black Belt, that South Side of Chicago. Yeah, so it was a very interclass community, right? Because you had poor Black people, but you also had very well-to-do working class and middle class Black doctors and professors and politicians from that same area. So they were all just kind of forced to live there. And so again, the unjust housing legislation politicized the racism. It also allowed for white people to live both in the city, but then they could also live in the suburbs. So usually the white people in the city were poor or working class, and the white people in the suburbs away from everybody, those were the middle class and upper middle class and upper class white folks. And so this kind of reinforced the idea of Black urban poverty. The fact that white people were able to spread out and live where they wanted to live versus the Black people who are only forced to live in the urban sector. And that's why sometimes even now, when we say urban, you talk about, when people talk about urban music or urban culture or urban whatever, urban clothing, it's always like synonymous with Black. Even if you go in malls, they say, oh, this is the urban section. I'm like, do you mean Black? Just say Black. Like, that's what you mean. You know, but some people don't want to say race. They don't, you know, talk about colorblind, stuff like that. They don't want to, they want to appear colorblind. So say Black, that's the Black. Or they might say hip hop or something like that. Like, they got this coded language for Black anyway. But people even use that now. However, if you go into a lot of predominantly or particularly large metropolitan cities, not really like this in Jacksonville that I've seen, but in large metro cities like Atlanta or Chicago or Houston or Los Angeles or New York, urban is now very white. The city is now synonymous with the white liberal, white progressive, funky, supposed to be non-racist white people. That's kind of what the urban sector is now. So the urban really don't mean white like it used to mean. I mean, urban doesn't really mean Black like people, you know, it did in maybe the 70s, 80s, and 90s. But that's what these kitchenettes did. Like, it reinforced this, you know, synonymity between Blackness and urban, right? And if you lived in the city, you were poor, you were Black. If you lived outside, you were middle class, upper middle class. So, but this isn't unique to Chicago. It exists in Atlanta, it exists in New York, it exists in all these other places and spaces. So kitchenettes were essentially the parents of housing projects. So if you know anything about housing projects, again, same thing. They were put in place to, you know, for that transition, you know, the transitory period. But African Americans were forced to kind of stay there, and then didn't receive a lot of funding, so they just kind of was running to the ground. So by the time you get to the 50s and 60s and the civil rights movement, now you start to see more Black people who are fighting for fair housing. That was a big issue. I was a part of the civil rights movement, and not only civil rights, but there's a lot of different movements that were going on in the 50s and 60s. That's just the main one. But the Black nationalist movement, the Pan-African movement, the Brown Power movement, the women's rights movement, although the women's rights movement didn't deal with a lot of housing, but women had difficulty of, you know, procuring housing on their own without a man signing off or a husband or something like that. So housing was a big issue, but definitely along racial lines. And so Black people were forced to live in these kitchenettes for three reasons. One, because it was the only thing that was affordable, because the homes were purposely, especially homes in the predominantly white areas, were purposely overpriced because they knew most Black people could not afford them. And even the Black people that could afford them, like Daniel Hale Williams or other, you know, well-to-do Richard Wright, who was a famous author coming out of Chicago during that time, those people that could afford them, you know, were allowed to live in those neighborhoods anyway. So it's just It was the only thing available. Number two, policies didn't allow blacks to live with whites. So even the rich black people still forced to live in the black belt next to the super, super poor black people. And then these were the opportunities that were marketed towards blacks. So even in the black newspapers, the black magazines, Marcus Garvey, famous African-American black leader, had a newspaper out, the UNIA newspaper, the Universal Negro Improvement Association. I think was it the Black? I know he had the Black Star Line. I don't know if his newspaper was called the Black Star, but the only housing that was marketed in those newspapers were the kitchenettes, right? So it was a word that essentially enabled Rashad Shabazz to address the way that these very tiny flats enclosed black people and brought this power of carcerality, brought the power of structural oppression inside the home. And then it talks about how black people, kitchenettes were kind of a way to talk about how black people were kind of warehoused into these areas. So when we say warehouse, again, if you know of a warehouse, it's just a bunch of rooms inside of a huge building. And that's essentially what these kitchenettes were. And so black people protested these kitchenettes. They protested the conditions. And they did it by sometimes running away. All right, sometimes they ran away and went to try to live other places. Sometimes they left these big cities to try to move to either another big city or maybe back down south. Sometimes they would move to a city that was a little bit better, because again, Chicago was known for this. So some people moved from Chicago to Harlem. And Harlem was a place where it was much more free. Still people were confined, but at least you could move about in the city, right? As opposed to just in one part of the city. It's kind of like, it's interesting because I lived in Atlanta for a long time, but then I also visited Los Angeles. And in visiting Los Angeles, it was very similar. Los Angeles would have been Chicago, Harlem would have been Atlanta, where there's a spreading out of blackness that exists in somewhere like Atlanta, where black people just live all over the place. They just kind of take over the city from a population standpoint. I don't want to go too deep into that. That's a much more extensive discussion. But then I also had a friend of mine who went with me to LA, but she was originally from Compton, and talked about how that's not how it is in Los Angeles. Black people don't live all over the city. They live in specific areas, and they can thrive in those areas, like a Compton, like Inglewood or South Central. But the essence to which blackness exists does not, it is not seen all over the city. And so because of that, again, you see examples of those things happening again, even now. So that is how Chicago was. And so some of them did begin to run away to other areas, begin to run away to, to other places and spaces, so that they can feel the need to be themselves, to be completely free, to experience the mobility that one should be able to experience in a place called the land of opportunity. However, some policies did not allow them to escape too far, but to essentially run to other spaces that was within the Black belt. So sometimes they couldn't go all the way to Harlem for whatever reason. Sometimes they could only go from one part of the Black belt to the other. So they were just stuck. They were literally stuck in this same kind of trap. While being told this narrative, and I think we talked about this earlier with the boys, well, how come Black people can't rise out of their situation? You got all these opportunities. You're not slaves no more. Yeah, it's Jim Crow, but you got schools. We gave all this money for Black schools. You have your own hospital. Why can't you rise? But when you have segregation that doesn't allow you to have access to the things necessary for mobility, these are the reasons. And so you have this larger meaning of space that is important for us to pay attention to when looking at these these types of situations. Space is one of the most important and significant illustrators of uneven development, access, and social order. And so anytime we're having any type of assessment about race and gender and inequality and unfair treatment, discrimination, we always have to look at place, we always have to look at space. I mean, it's even there in gender. If you look at The Origins of Social Life by Kuntz, one of the biggest things that she deals with, even in the mistreatment of women in the 1950s and 60s, during what's considered the golden era or the age of the American family, where you have, and I talk about this in my intro classes on my, sociology courses that are not specifically dealing with race, but we go into race, gender, sex, all that other kind of stuff. One of the things they talk about is the confined treatment of white women specifically in the domestic space. They could not branch outside into areas of education, areas of employment, areas of politics. They were only confined to the domestic space of the home. And that essentially drove many of them, it would drive a lot of them crazy. It was psychologically damaging for many of them because they did not have the opportunity to be more than just a housewife. And so it's probably one of the most violent times for women, but it gets portrayed as everybody being a part of this harmonious domestic life for, particularly white Americans. So space is extremely important, even if you're talking about race, whether you're talking about gender, whether you're talking about anything, space is important. It's also a reflection of social hierarchy. So looking at people who tend to be more confined are people who fall lower on a social hierarchy. Okay, so if you are, so people who have more space tend to be higher, right? The more space you have, think about it, somebody has money based on, generally speaking, based on how big the house is, right? If you have, the more house you have, it's likely the more expensive it'll be. Obviously, depending on the city, you can have a crazy, however many $1 million home and it's super small in New York or something like that. But generally speaking, if you have a big home, that means you have a certain class status. That means you have a certain social status. So space is a reflection of whatever hierarchy or wherever you fall on a hierarchy. Geography makes social and political inequalities visible by situating them within this physical space. And so how we look at people's geographical makeup, where people are in the city, demographics, and the types of people that live in certain areas allows us to see how visible inequalities are, especially when we apply it to the physical space, which is why we know of the cities that have certain sides of town where we may go or we may not go. Or if I tell you exactly where I grew up and you know the city of Jacksonville, then you can make a certain distinction about who I was or what my class status was based on where I told you I grew up, right? Or where I tell you I live. So if I say, oh, well, this is the area that I live in, immediately, if you know the city, then you'll be able to say, oh, then there's a good chance these things are related to him, right? So geography allows for us to see these social and political inequalities when we understand physical space. So it's not a coincidence when poor people of color, immigrants, people who are sick. So again, we're going past race into all different types of modes of oppression. People who are disabled, people who are prisoners, people who are women, all these people from different marginalized groups, when they live together in these geographical areas, that means that space is largely connected to levels of oppression. If you see an area where a lot of immigrants are, much likely you're going to see an area with low quality education formal education. You're going to see an area that is a food desert. You're going to see an area that sicknesses tend to rise the most. All right. That's just what happens. It's what's called the matrices of domination. One form of domination spirals into other forms of domination. That's Patricia Hill Collins. Also, the matrices of domination also shows that if you can dominate in one part of society, you dominate in other parts. If you're white, then if you're white and middle class, or white and middle class and a male, or white middle class and male and Protestant or Christian, or white middle class Christian heterosexual, like you have all of these areas of domination that exist for you. So again, you have these compounding notions of dominance, and you have compounding notions of oppression. And so space is fundamental to a person's identity. And we depend on space when we begin to create meanings to explain the world around us and to highlight what is particular about us. So again, if I were to tell you, I think I saying where I grew up on the north side of Jacksonville. Some people from Jacksonville may know, some people may not know. I don't know if it's that much different. I've only been over maybe a few times recently, but Jacksonville is very much divided mostly along class lines, but there's definitely some racial lines there as well. There's some flip-flop happening, particularly around education, especially in busing. So I know when I grew up in the 90s, it was illegal, but I was able to attend a white school on the South Side because my parents knew somebody in our church, a Black woman who taught at the white school. And so she got me over there illegally, but I got a really good education, and it set me up for success in the future, because I was able to go to college prep middle school and a college prep high school. But my side of town didn't have a school like that. My side of town was the school was more of a poor working class school. So it's situations like that where describing a space would then explain or tell you the conditions in which that person might live, right? Space also plays a role in the production of identity. So physical space and where one is located within tells us much about the space of that subject, right? So basically everything I just said. So we are susceptible to the spaces we inhabit. However, we do not have to become the spaces we inhabit. So just because you inhabit a certain space doesn't necessarily you have to be or fulfill the stereotypes of that space. Just because you live in a poor working class area, or you live in an area that, unfortunately, because of lower level conditions, it doesn't have higher rates of crime, but there are reported higher rates of crime, higher rates of reported crimes happening in that area. It doesn't necessarily mean you have to identify with that. Although other people may identify you with that, you don't have to identify as that. Or if you grew up rich and wealthy, just because people would identify a rich, wealthy person as a person who's a snob or selfish or it's all about money, it doesn't necessarily mean you have to identify as that yourself. There's a lot of people across class groups, across racial groups, across gender groups that do a lot of good. And there are people across those groups that do a lot of harm. And so your space does not have to define who you are. And so now we're going to go into American Apartheid. American Apartheid is a book that was written, I want to say it was published in 94 or 93. But they started doing the research in the 80s. Douglas Massey and Nancy Denton, two sociologists. I want to say they both were out of Harvard at the time. Now Douglas Massey is at Princeton. But They did a lot of research and wrote this book called American Apartheid. I think the reason why they call it apartheid is because at the time the South African apartheid movement was just really big. So it was really good. It was masterful masterful marketing. Because the book flew off the shelves. Even though technically, it is about apartheid because it's about separation, but it don't have nothing to do with what you think about when you think about apartheid. But the naming is just that's just masterful. That's how you sell a book, man. I'm telling you, masterful marketing. So anyway, it's called American Apartheid. They definitely cheat you with the title, but it doesn't matter because you bought the book. So, but it's really about residential segregation, and they talk about the making of underclass, how underclass is created, how poverty is created, and how poverty is reinforced through segregation, right? So I would highly encourage you to watch student videos on this topic. Watch all the student videos because they're really good. I'm still grading them. I'm still going through them, but I'm really enjoying them. So make sure you watch the student videos. You're going to have an assignment on it anyway, so you got to at least watch one for right now. And then, but I want you to watch this YouTube video. It's about 6 minutes long. And I feel like Massey does a really good job of just summarizing what is being discussed in American apartheid and about residential segregation. He goes into a lot of the things I've already discussed, I've already talked about. He does a good job of explaining it with the historical context. You can actually see the lines of what they call the index of dissimilarity, which is a measuring of the levels of segregation that has happened over a period of time in specific spaces in the city. And so, it goes to show when these levels of segregation increase, when they decrease, based on what was happening in the larger society, whether you're talking about civil rights, whether you're talking about the Reagan era, whether you're talking about the industrialization, whatever. So it does a really, really good job of that. And then also provides some solutions, more just one solution in particular, about how we can create much more class diverse. And when we say class, we mean class and race, racially diverse neighborhoods, particularly around not confining affordable housing to one area, but allowing for affordable housing to exist in areas across the city. So really, really good. So check that out. Look at that YouTube link, and then come back and again, watch the student videos on this topic because they do a really good job of talking about American apartheid. So a lot of that information you can also apply to your notes, and then we will go into HarlemWorld. All right. So Harlem as a place. John Jackson did this research on Harlem, and I really like this book because it's really one of the first texts that I've read that really deals with a real it's a really good interclass analysis of Black life in the urban sector. A lot of times when we think about Blackness, and I'll say this again on this slide, but a lot of times it's synonymous with poverty, right? So even in some of the things that we've talked about the Black Belt, Chicago, and all this other kind of stuff. And in your mind, typically you think about urban poverty, the first thing that comes in your mind is these poor Black people running around in the city, whatever. But it's rare that we really take the time to talk about middle class Black people or middle class minorities in general. You say Mexicans, immediately you think about these poor people who are immigrants, who are coming over, working class, working on people's homes and roofs and stuff. And like these are kind of the stereotypical ideas that we have. You think white, you think whiteness, you think, plush, living well, opportunity. But It's not always like that, especially now, right? Now, there is still levels of inequality along racial lines for sure. There is a disparity. There's a disproportionate number of minorities, particularly Black people and Latinx people, that do live in poverty in comparison. We talk about percentages to white people. However, the levels of poverty, or the number of people living in poverty, are not as high, I want to say, as they used to be. Now, concentrated poverty is different. Concentrated poverty is absolutely very high. Well, actually, yeah, because the number, well, yeah, because if you, again, in the city, if you talk about the numbers of people in poverty across the country, I mean, you have higher numbers of white people in poverty, which is the reason why white people are more likely to benefit from government programs such as like welfare and WIC and things like that. It actually negatively affects them more than it does people of color. But yeah, the class conversations have to be much more nuanced. And I think HarlemWorld does a good job of that, which is why HarlemWorld is a whole book. It was difficult for me to pick which chapter I wanted you to read. So I have a summary of it, and then I have this one piece on HarlemWorld that specifically deals with the method, but I like the piece because, and you could, optionally read the summary, but the piece towards an ethnography, quotation mark spaces, I thought was really good because it allows for us to go deeper into the narratives within the book. So you can actually read what the people were telling the author when he was interviewing them or when he was watching them in this kind of natural observation, ethnographic study. And so with that, he allows for us to see the ways in which communities police each other. We all have symbolic boundaries. We all create boundaries among each other, even if we're all in the same place, even at UNF. We're all on the same campus, all here for a purpose, educate the next generation. But there are symbolic boundaries, racial boundaries, class boundaries, gender boundaries. And sometimes even within a specific group, there's boundaries. Even within the white middle class, you may have boundaries along politics, boundaries along sexuality. And so even in Harlem as a place, there's class boundaries that exist in that area. And so in order for us to understand these interclass spaces that we talked about even in Chicago in the Black Belt, there's an interclass that's happening. Now, most of the research about the Black Belt doesn't really talk about that. Well, there's one. What is the name of that? The Black Metropolis. I think it's called the Black Metropolis. Written in the 40s. It does a pretty good job of doing that. But anyway, John Jackson, I think, does a better job. His was written a lot later, though. So Harlem has this symbolism of Blackness. Harlem was created during the Great Migration of white people from the South to the North. And as they began to move, they found that Harlem was a place where they could kind of be themselves. First, it was largely controlled, at least from a population standpoint, by the Jewish population, the Jewish community, and then the Puerto Rican community. And then later on, you have the Black community that moves in and kind of makes Harlem this staple and a home. And more specifically, it does have this racial significance of being the capital of Black America. So Harlem is indubitably this space of Blackness and has this contextual, contingent kind of racialization of a place, particularly a Black place. But when we look at Blackness in Harlem, as Black as it is, or as Black as sometimes it's imagined to be, especially when you start looking at the hierarchical elements of Harlem, we start to see that it is imagined by those who look at its name, but this Blackness requires a lot more depth, and the racial criteria for understanding Black place or Black space has to include class differences, gender hierarchies, ethnicity, for us to really begin to understand the spatial boundaries around place. Which is why John Jackson calls for what he calls a quotation marked off, or he calls Harlem quotation marked off places. Which essentially what he's saying is that it is a kind of place that apart has these geographic, but also iconographic, spatial meanings and significations. So when you're reading that text about the quotation marked off places, you have people who talk about Harlem, but then they say Harlem, but it's not Manhattan. Because if you've ever been to Harlem, Harlem is really Manhattan, but it's the Black part of Manhattan. So it's just called Harlem. But essentially downtown New York, that's how Harlem is. Harlem and Manhattan is the same place, but it's different because one is Black. I remember going there August 2019, and that's what they told me. In fact, my cousins, my family is most on my mom's side, well, me and my dad's side is mostly from Jacksonville. But I had an auntie who moved to New York and lived there from like the 80s all the way to now. And I remember my cousins who lived there, we would talk to them. Sometimes they would come down south for family reunions or something. But they lived there, and when we would ask them where they live or where they're from, they would say Manhattan. They would never say Harlem because of the quotation marked off place. They wanted to make it sound like they were what? From the white area. Manhattan sounds a lot better because when you think about Manhattan, if you're not living in New York, or even if you're living in New York, you think about the white area, it's downtown, it's upper class, it's beautiful, it's Manhattan, the movie stars, the this, the that. At that time, if she would have told us we live in Harlem, we would have thought, oh, so that must be the ghetto side. Now, when I went to Harlem to visit, well, actually, I had to go there for business, but and I had to present at a conference and some other stuff. But I asked her where I was going or where her address is because I didn't want to spend all that money on a hotel. So I went to stay with my cousin, and it said Harlem. I'm like, all this time I thought you lived in Manhattan. She said, well, I just said Manhattan because I wanted to sound bougie, but she lived in Harlem, right? So again, these quotation mark off places is like, I'm in Harlem, I don't know, I'm in Manhattan, but I'm really in Manhattan, but I really live in Harlem, the part that's not Manhattan. So you have these exceptions of place that gets marked off for what reasons? For class reasons, for hierarchy reasons, for gender reasons, for all these other reasons, which is why they have to be included when we're assessing Black space. So when you think about, even when people describe Harlem in this study, there's a sense of belonging from within and a threat from the people without. So there are people who live in Manhattan or in other parts of New York that want to separate themselves from the Harlemites, and people in Harlem who don't want Harlem to be associated with Manhattan. Because Manhattan might be the white bourgeoisie side, and I want to be cool from the Black side where it's hip, where it's happening, even though it might be poorer than Manhattan, but it's still cooler in terms of culture. So there is this constant give and take, push and pull when one talks about identity as it relates to space. So there are these multi-layered understandings of place And people put a stake in space based on how they define it. And then they defend that space, they defend that place, and police its meaning with a vengeance. No, I don't live in Harlem. I live in Manhattan. No, you don't. You live in Harlem. Stop trying to act like you're something that you're not. No, I don't live in this area. I live in that area. I live in the south side of Jacksonville. Well, I live on the south side, but I don't live close to the beach or close to UNF. I live close to this side where there's more real people and not on the bougie side. Well, I live in this area, but I live on the north side of Jacksonville, but I don't live in the Moncrief area. I live in the Dunn Avenue area. So there's these quotation marks that we put around space and place for these reasons that we need to study. It's a way of identifying, it's a way of protecting ourselves, and it's an important template for thinking not just about how people connect to place, but also how people connect to each other and what people think about each other. And that's a very important part of understanding place, particularly around class. So going into class conversations in Black place, you start to see a meeting where the underclass starts to meet the middle class space. Something that doesn't exist in Rashad Shabanz's work of the Black Belt. Something that doesn't exist a lot in the class conversations. People usually talk about the middle class by themselves, or the working class by themselves, or the poor by themselves, or sometimes the poor and working class together, but not a connection. And rightfully so, mostly for white people, because white people don't necessarily connect a lot across class lines. That's just the research talking. Geographically, they're very much distant in terms of space. So you don't have a lot of white underclass spaces that are next to white upper middle class spaces. Doesn't really exist a lot. But in Black communities and in Latinx communities, they're all there. From the Black Belt all the way to today. So even if you go on the south side of Chicago now, ooh, I think Michelle Obama still goes there sometimes when she visits. I want to say the Obama's house is still on the south side. Steve Harvey, very prominent TV host, house is still on the south side. But also a lot of hip hop rappers, Chicago rappers come from the south side. They're all on that same side of town. Poor, working class, middle class, upper middle class, wealthy. But you don't find that a lot when it comes to white place. So social science literature would call the underclass, right, this impoverished group that is tarnished from the legacy of the Mecca, of the Black America. But they're denied access, at least symbolically, to the idea of the Mecca. And so when you look at, like, let's say, for example, if you read the reading, when you look at how Cynthia was one of the people in the reading, she has this kind of no nonsense idea about Harlem and Harlemites. Harlem is looked at and asserted to the exclusion of the stereotypical representations of urban America. She's looking at Harlem as this beautiful Black space and place, while at the same time ignoring or marginalizing the stereotypical Blackness that could be associated with Harlem. She doesn't see the significance of both of those things. And so stereotypes like the foreground poverty, the criminality, the drug use, it's looked at as kind of this emblematic kind of feel that can constitute place itself. But these negative images, she may not apply to the type of Harlem that she wants to portray. And there's a lot of different examples of that in the reading and in the book itself. So contrary to these negative images and depictions of urban America, the example of Cynthia in the text looks at Harlem as this place where you can be fun, you can be free. There's no racism because you're not really interacting with white people like that. It's just a great place. Like what she says, like what it used to be, like how it used to be during the Harlem Renaissance and when Black people first moved to Harlem and all of that. So that's how she understands Harlem, but within the conversation around class. Also, if we look at another example around class conversations in Black place, you start to see people like Miss Joseph. Miss Joseph was another person in the reading. And Miss Joseph had neighbors like Cynthia, who were so-called beggars, poor working class, that they shared these same physical surroundings, but excluded them from being associated with the place. So they too were a part of Harlem, but not a part of Harlem. So there was this socioeconomic status symbols, these socioeconomic economic status symbols that function as part of the criteria that was used to shift out who could have access to the social landscape. And it separated who was legitimately Harlem from who was illegitimately Harlem. So you had examples of people like Miss Joseph and Cynthia that would look at the socioeconomic ladder. They might look at some of these undesirables. They would look at the poor, the working class, the beggars, the robbers, whoever, the people that they did not associate with being from Harlem. And they would challenge sometimes they would challenge them. And then other times they might challenge their upper class race mates that might call Harlem home. Upper class race mates, their rights to call Harlem home. So there are these examples of how race and class plays a role in who can have access to space and who can be defined or be labeled as that place or with that place. So when we look at these class conversations around Black place, we see a world where stereotypes, things that are looked at to be real but are not real, have a huge impact on people's lives. And what happens is it disproves this very easy argument about power and what appears to be real, but it's not real. And these unreal assumptions about a person, about a place itself, and then people that are embodying that place, they impact decisions about big businesses, who moves there, whether people should move there. It informs where people may eat, where people may live, where people may shop. And so identity plays a big role in determining factors in the real lived experiences of people and places. And so this is why Chuck, who was another person in the book, says, Harlem is like a person you got to take the time to know. When you know Harlem, she will treat you right. And if you don't take the time to, she won't. She'll lie to you and you'll be stupid enough to believe it, because people do every day. They think Harlem is this, but it ain't. It's that, and they don't get it and won't believe you when you tell them they're wrong. So when we look at place, we're looking at people. And we're looking at place as a combination of people's experiences, both real and unreal. And so what is real? What is Harlem? What is Jacksonville? What is Chicago? What is Mississippi? What is Atlanta? What is Los Angeles? What is Tulsa? It's tricky. It's dynamic. It's intersectional. it's both real and unreal, but it's also a reality because it shapes what ends up happening. It shapes the narrative of that place, and then it shapes the way that place is then, or it shapes the future of that place based on that narrative. So I know that particular understanding these class conversations around place and all of that, especially that last part, can get a little, I don't know, kind of tricky, abstract, if you will. But if you have any questions about it, let me know. If you want to talk about it, I'm enjoying the emails that I get from you all. Some people are like watching the lectures and then they'll just like, oh, that was interesting, and just shoot me an email and I'll respond. So I try to do that just to have some interaction with you all since we can't be together. So yeah, but if you have any questions, reach out. So you do have a discussion board assignment. On the next slide, you are required to engage in the discussion board posts. It's called student video lecture response. Make sure you look at the syllabus for how you're supposed to engage in the discussion. And I want you to do the following. I want you to watch one of the student lecture videos in its entirety. So you can either watch one by going to pages and going to lectures, and then you'll see them there, or going to files and going to student lecture PowerPoints, and you can see some there. You're going to write a detailed response about the video or presentation that you watch. Then you're going to talk about in your response, what were some of the strong points about the presentation? What would you have added to the presentation if you were doing a presentation on that topic? And then what were some key points that you took away from that presentation or that video? Make sure you follow the instructions that are on the syllabus. They should be fulfilled before 3 p.m. on October 4th. So yeah, just want to make sure this is right. Yeah, 3 p.m. on October 4th. And yep, and you have an exam on October 6th. So if you have any other questions, let me know. I can be reached via email, inbox, whatever, office hours. And see you soon.